Professor Peggy Kern, it is a pleasure to welcome you to our conference about creating stability within uncertainty. Professor Peggy Kern, you are a professor at the University of Melbourne and also the founder and first president of the Positive Education Division in the International Positive Psychology Association. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be joining you as well.
So you are now positioned in Melbourne for quite, a few years. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about COVID-19 in Australia and maybe also in Melbourne. What's the situation? What was the situation for education system? How did people cope? What's going on?
Yeah, so it's been pretty interesting here in Australia. Things started really becoming uncertain in March as we started to see more cases occurring. There were a few schools where there was a COVID positive case. They shut down the school. And so there was a lot of sense of, okay, we're going to be locked down without really understanding what that was going to be. And then the third week in March, I believe, we went into stage 3 restrictions, which this was across Australia, which we shut down all travel. So closed our borders. And the schools, they actually we were heading towards the end of term. So they just went on holidays a week early just to be like, okay, let's just get on holidays and send everyone home so that we're not doing the remote learning and whatnot. And through that period, the Australian people really just sort of seemed to bond together, and it was like, we're all in this together and we're going to get through it and whatnot. We could leave home for a few reasons, including going to the store, and we could still exercise. That was about it. So then as we headed towards the end of holidays, there was the real question of, do we go back to school? Do we not go back to school? And the decision was made at that time that everything's going to be remote learning. So essentially all of our teachers knew this was coming and did not get a holiday because they spent all of that holiday period rapidly trying to figure out how to do online learning. So it was a huge, massive learning curve for all of our teachers, high stress, and then on to term 2 and doing online learning through all sorts of different platforms. Different schools did things in different ways. So some actually said, okay, everything is actually about, we really need to be connecting with our young people. And so they would record material, and then they had scheduled time to be checking in with each of their young people to really see how they're really going. And others were like, no, just doing the curriculum and things like that. And so there were a lot of varied responses on that. Some of our schools that have a lot of sort of high risk or disadvantaged students really did a lot of efforts because they were really, really concerned about the young people. And some of that worked well, but we also saw a lot of limits with technology in terms of huge inequity issues in terms of access to internet. And so even as we navigated through that time, you had some students who did really well with home learning. Some did not at all. And with some of our disadvantaged ones, the ones that really had a lot of the check-ins and whatnot, some of them actually traveled through things really well. It was the most kind of one-on-one support and whatnot that they had. Others have probably stepped away, and we can't get them back into the school system. So went through term 2, and then in June, we were heading towards easing of restrictions. And so there was a very thorough plan across Australia in terms of checkpoints, in terms of what was opened up over time. And with that, the schools were going to go back to meeting in person. And about this time, our cases were, in some states, we had no cases. In others, we were very, very low numbers. And so it really was, Australia was quite effective in our response to the coronavirus. And as students went back, many of our teachers, it was very clear that essentially it was like starting at the beginning of the year. So a lot of those social emotional skills and whatnot were out the window. Some of the schools were essentially almost, it was like this sense of, we're a term behind, we have to get on with our learning. Others were like, everything is actually about student well-being right now, is we actually really need to focus on the young people. And so how the schools actually navigated that has had an impact on both the teachers and the students. As we then headed towards the end of June, most of Australia was in good shape, but Melbourne kind of had issues, and we ended up, our cases started rising, and beginning of July, we went back down into lockdown. But interestingly enough so we were actually school holidays again when lockdown happened. And so the question is, do the schools go back? And there was a lot of stressing and trying to figure out what to do. There's a lot of concern about students, a lot of parents not wanting to do home learning, just the struggles of trying to balance work and school. What they ended up deciding to do is to have the year 11 and 12s go back, because they're studying for their BCs and ATAR and other exams. So kind of the entrance exams to the university. So we already know that those are year levels that are the highest level of anxiety and stress because of the anxiety over academics. Also some of our early years, and so the first few years, because of the social and emotional skills, not wanting those to lose out. And then all of our specialist schools. So any of our disadvantaged students, and those have consistently stayed open through all of the lockdowns and whatnot, is really feeling it's so incredibly important to have that support for the disadvantaged students there as much as possible. Some of them disconnect regardless. So at this time, most learning is happening online for young people, with a lot of there's fights over people trying to feel like we have to get academics done, and others just being like, learning's not happening this year, and maybe that's actually okay. But especially with our young people who are in the schools, there's all sorts of other stresses as well. So when they go, they have to have temperature checks, they have to wear masks. If we get a positive COVID case in a school, they shut down the school again, have to do full clean. And so the students are already dealing with the anxiety about studying for exams, with that constant sense of, well, will we have school today, or are we back at home? And for our teachers, that constantly trying to be like, not even knowing, are we doing online learning, in person, mixed learning, and their own anxieties about virus. So Melbourne's been a interesting kind of difference from some of the other states, where some of the other states, it's really, really opening up. But we're also seeing flow-on effects into some of the mental health issues. And so we are seeing a lot more mental health issues, some huge concerns around suicidality and things like that. And so there's a real sense that a lot of young people are really struggling.
Well, you're describing a complex situation. It certainly sounds very challenging. Any qualities, any strategies that can help educators deal with these, kind of difficulties and challenges?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one thing that I have seen in the Australian response throughout is really kind of from a leadership level. Actually, there's always diverse opinions and whatnot, but actually a lot of sort of clarity and guidance on things. And so all decisions have been made. They're coming out of, this is what the data is telling us. There's agreement from from the highest level, from the Prime Minister through the premiers. There's been a lot of states all working together around things. And so there's very, very clear messaging coming from the premier, who is our kind of like our governor or whatever, the education minister and whatnot. And so there are kind of, that helps with some of the uncertainty. I think it's when we're in the in-between of like, we might be locked down, we're not, in that uncertainty, that people have a really hard time with that. Once those decisions are made and there's the clear communication about it, that helps with some of the uncertainty on things. So that's sort of at a broader kind of really big systems level. One thing I've really seen in the schools is a lot of different responses on things. So the schools that have really said, you know what, we actually don't need to make, academics don't need to be our highest priority right now. We always like worry about test scores and things like that. Some of the schools have gotten rid of grades or tests this year, and they're like, you know what, we're just going to help our young people and our teachers go through that. And some of the schools have really said, you know, we really need to be taking care of our teachers well. Other schools have really not. They've really put a lot of pressure on the academics. Students are falling apart. Teachers are completely stressed out. So some of our schools, you know, they're heading back. Okay, they're coming back from online learning the next week and have no idea what to expect. So there was no kind of messaging coming from leadership of how we're even going to be functioning. That added a lot of stress to our teachers, and then they were falling apart, and then they're dealing with all of the anxieties and whatnot of the young people. So I think that number one is the more that those who are in more leadership positions are actually, even as they're dealing with their own uncertainties and pressures, the more that they can give sort of a clear message and break through some of that uncertainty, even though if we know it might be changing, that adds a bit of calmness to things. A second thing is really prioritizing the mental health and well-being of both students and staff members. A lot has focused on students at the expense of staff, and I think that's challenging on things. And then the other thing is the letting go of it having to be the way it always is. So, you know, in some schools, it's all like, well, we actually don't know how to do this. And so we're going to play with it and almost just, we're going to try things out. It's not going to work, and that's okay. Versus those that kind of be like, it has to be this way, and kind of pushing that forward in ways that have been problematic. I think trying to rigidly stick to structures can cause some challenges on things. So I think those are at least a couple different things that I've seen unfolding here.
So if I can, first of all, this is very helpful, I think. And I think, so you've talked about the clear messages, the prioritizing well-being of students and staff. You talked about being flexible, right, in terms of understanding that things are not going to be the same and you need to restructure, rethink about things. And also in some point, I don't know if it, you know, if it's what you meant, but surrender to the situation. This is not going to be a regular year, no matter, you know, what we think about it or what we plan. So just accept it and see what you can take out of it.
I think there's that huge element of that acceptance piece. And I think I've seen this in different schools in terms of what I think of in terms of rushing too quickly to the normal versus actually sitting in it and saying, you know what, we're going to acknowledge that things aren't okay, but that's actually okay. We're actually going to get through this together. So it's sort of like, yes, we accept, we don't like any of this, obviously, but just sort of, we're going to accept it and we're going to try to make the best of it. It has been interesting in sort of the second lockdown. People are finding the second lockdown a lot harder than the first one. The first one was really, it was a sort of like adrenaline, everyone rushing in, we're going to get through this together, this real spirit coming together. And I think the second lockdown, there's just this real sense of really just sort of surrendering to the situation, is just sort of like, this sucks. And, you know, we're not going to get much done, and that's actually okay. Is just sort of, we're just going to kind of try to survive the year and then like reset next year or something. And so I think those that are trying to actually fight it end up with more challenges, and those that say, okay, we're going to get through this, but we're going to get through it together. So I think that's that other aspect of things, is thinking that we're all going through this together. And the more that we can bond together and be supporting each other through that, whether that's me supporting my students, supporting other staff members, the community as a whole bonding together in little ways to care for each other. I think those are some really key aspects getting people through.
we have to carry each other in some way,
Yes.
right? 'Cause also,
More so than ever. I mean, you know, we are interconnected beings. And I think this whole crisis has really showed how interconnected we are. And some of the biggest problems coming out of things is because people feel isolated and alone. And in our latest restrictions now, we all have to wear masks. And it's fascinating how challenging that is for people, in part because we're like, you don't have the facials anymore. And there's that level of everyone being in their own world, which is a feeling of isolation. And yet you see people trying to connect in different ways. And I think that's that beautiful part, is things aren't always good, but if we bond together and we support each other along the way, who knows where we can actually take all of this in the future.
yeah. Thank you. This has been very helpful. I just have one more question, which was not planned. So I hope it is okay to be spontaneous. So this situation was very challenging, or is still, I think, right now in Melbourne, very challenging. But is there anything that we can see as a point of learning, or something that we actually do better, or any highlights in this, with all of the difficulties and challenges and the real risks even?
Yeah, you know, I think some of the good things coming out of that, and that's where I think those are sort of the seeds of hope that occur at times. You know, one thing is just that almost reconnection that has happened, is that, you know, there was a lot of, you know, I even think about things with like the technology, and we were like really concerned about young people being online all the time. And now they have to be online all the time for all their learning. And so they actually want to go to the park. You know, it's all like people are being more active than ever. And they're doing it as families. And so families that hardly ever saw each other, you know, you actually have parents that are actually home and having some amazing relationships that never actually would have happened. And I think those are the hearts of things, of sort of some of those, you know, those actually become very special learning times, and special times that perhaps will actually sit with the young people for a very long time. I think the other thing is, we worry about the anxieties, we worry about some of the mental health challenges, and all of that's real. But we've also seen young people be amazingly resilient as well. And in many ways, I think this is teaching a lot of skills about, you know, when challenge is there, how do we actually respond to it? And what are some ways that we can do that, and perhaps learn that in the future? And then the final thing I would say is, I think it has made us question our priorities. Is that in Australia, the main focus has been on academic testing, and it's all the time about how problematic that is. And I think a lot of this has actually questioned, you know, is that necessarily the end all thing, or is it actually about helping the development of our young people? And I think there's that press of wanting to keep going back to the academics, but I think there's that desire to actually say, we need to actually start with mental health and well-being. And if we can actually start bringing that in and start rethinking some of the ways that we do education in ways that are actually going to be supportive of the entire young person's development in healthy ways for each young person, then I think that could be a real win with things.
That's a wonderful, wonderful way to end this conversation. I think, yeah, if this is one thing that the world will learn from this crisis, is to put more emphasis on well-being and question our priorities. That would be one good thing, maybe. I think I want to thank you for this very illuminating talk. A lot of, for me, very interesting insights. I think this was also very well connected to the ideas that we thought about in Israel related to the need for flexibility and the importance of creating uncertainty creating some certainty within the uncertainty by providing clarity and presence, and also surrender to the situation, accepting it. Yes. Thank you so much for these important insights also about the leadership and the kind of leading level. That was very helpful.
Thank you so much for letting me join you. And I wish each of you the very, very best in your journeys and all that you do.
To you too. And yeah, good luck in handling the current challenges.